and welcome to Live Your True Story. This is your host, Miok, and we're going to be exploring the lives of people who discovered their true path and are living very unique lives because of it. Not only are we going to be learning about the very interesting things that they're doing, but also learn how they broke from the mold and decided to take the adventure of living their own lives. Feel free to visit my Substack at Miok, that's meeok.substack.com, for a convenient list of links to all of the things discussed during our chat. And to learn more about my journey and services, please visit holdingcompassionate.space. Leslie Pate MacKinnon is a star in the adoption world. She is a licensed social worker. She trains therapists and professionals at universities and agencies all over the U.S. She runs workshops, gives seminars to educate people on adoption and other family constellations like sperm donors or people who grow up and find out that the person they've called their father is not their biological father. And so she's offered herself in the public light because she's a wonderful speaker. She's been on documentaries and Good Morning America and Dan Rather's investigative reports. She's also been in a book called The Girl Who Went Away, which she mentions in our conversation. It was an absolute pleasure to have her on this podcast. She's been a friend of mine now for some time, and it's been wonderful to have her as a friend and important to hear her experience as a birth mother, even though she's not my birth mother. I think I'd look a lot different if I were a MacKinnon. But she has a unique voice, and I think her story captures elements of the voices of many who aren't able to speak. She's done a lot of work on herself and can really articulate her experience as a birth mother, which is particularly helpful for a lot of adoptees, especially if you're not able to meet your own birth mother, just to have some idea of what the experience can be. Because from your end, as an adoptee, your birth mother and everything about her, all of her process, her life, her history, is just an abyss. And even though we may have strained relationships with our parents, it is a privilege to know things like your birth name and your real birthday, to have access to your family medical history, which I don't. So there's a lot to learn from her in the ways that we often learn from absence, in the same way that you learn about food from fasting, or the same way you learn about sex from celibacy. You can learn a lot about what it means to be a mother, hearing from women who had to surrender their children and find a way to come to terms with that. Today on the podcast, she will be talking about her first experience drinking ayahuasca at the retreat that I was lucky enough to host in November, and to talk about not only her process, but where this work fit in her life as she is now at the age of 77 years old, and also to talk about how this medicine took her to another level that she wasn't able to get to with other medicines, including other plant medicines, but also the deep level of trauma that she was able to access and release through not only the work of ayahuasca, but also with these magical indigenous healers. So I'm very excited for her to share her experience and all of the insights and wisdom that she has to share with or without plant medicine, and for everyone just to meet this incredible person who lives this life of service and is dedicated to her own personal healing and is definitely living her true story. Well, hello, Leslie. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today to share your experiences with plant medicine.
I am so glad to do it. In fact, I share with more people than sometimes want to know me, Oak, because I still feel the excitement for what I got to in that plant journey. It was otherworldly. That's what I can tell you. Otherworldly.
Can we start with you introducing yourself and just telling us who you are and yeah.
Absolutely. I'm Leslie Pate MacKinnon, and I'm in the adoption world because of the fact that I am a birth mother, which means I gave birth to two sons, not just one, and relinquished them both to adoption in the mid 60s. That's how I got my button for being in adoption land. And needless to say, that was the most traumatic event of my life, and there were plenty ahead of it. Then, after that, in my late teens, I went to college and decided that was one thing I could do well. And I became a therapist because I ran across a couple who weren't good ones, and I decided I wanted to be a good one. So I became a therapist, and that's what I did for my career, and always have felt incredibly blessed that it was a gift that I was given for all the things I had been through. And about midway through my career, I reunited with both of my sons. And then I began to specialize in learning about adoption and all of the psychological aftermath. So that's been the end of my career. I married very late in life, had twins at 43, my claim to fame, and raised them and have had a very full and a very good life given all the hurdles I had in the early years. So that's who I am. I practiced in the South in Atlanta, Georgia for 40 years and moved up to Asheville, North Carolina about 6 years ago to retire, and found that's the hardest thing I ever tried to do in my life, which is going to lead into how I got involved in plant journeys.
Yeah, you have had such an eventful life, very full, very rich, very textured experience. And in the adoption constellation, there are adoptees and birth mothers and adoptive parents. And it's very interesting to see where we all kind of fit into this larger puzzle. Is there something that you can share to kind of give us a sense of the birth mother community?
Yes, and I'll divide it a little bit. My era was in the 1960s, and they call that, it's often referred to as BSE, which means baby scoop era. It was a time when women could not raise a child and not be married, not if you were a decent sort and lived on the right side of the tracks, if you will. I remember my parents saying that numerous times. You really couldn't raise a child on your own. There was a huge societal ban against women being sexual or so forth. So that era, it wasn't optional. I don't think it's really optional in this era, and I'll get to that in a sec, but you gave up your child because that's what you were told to do. And I was sent off to an unwed mother's home and so on and so forth. But birth mothers today, I will also say, don't have as much choice as everybody thinks they do, because there's a big multi-billion-dollar adoption industry that has done a lot to promote adoption and how wonderful it is and how selfless it is if you give your child, if you're not in a position to raise them right now, because one, you're poor, or you may be in school, or whatever the complications are, you may not have a partner who will help you, then you can be selfless and loving and give that child to a couple who is ready and available to parent. And I often say we diss that one side of the adoption constellation quite a bit, the adoptive parents, and sometimes with a little reason, because they're the slowest to want to wake up to what adoption is really about. We birth parents and adoptees don't have much of a choice. At some point in our life, it starts to frazzle. All those things we were told don't make sense anymore. And we realize, I think I have been duped here. But nonetheless, women today are pressured and marketed for their children. They're coerced covertly by the industry, by society. I know a lot of people feel like we just rolled down the window and dropped out our children and never thought of them again. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think one of the most amazing remarks that was ever said to me was a good friend who, after she read a book I had been quoted in, said, "Leslie, I just always thought adoption was so wonderful. And then I read that book, The Girls Who Went Away, and I said, can you imagine having given up any one of your three children?" And she said, "It blew me out of the water. It was like not possible." And I suddenly realized how none of you could ever recover from that. So I think birth mothers are seen as either bag ladies or poor and no teeth or whatever, or heartless women who just brush those kids out the door. And there's a lot more to us. There's a lot of depth, and we never got over what happened. There's much more of a community today of women who come together and talk about these experiences. So I'm glad to be here to represent that side of the adoption family.
I'm so glad to have you here to do that. As you were speaking, I had this sort of parallel thought process going on about the current abortion debate and how this very much relates. It's almost like a sibling, right? Abortion and adoption, very, very sibling issues, because often it's like, yeah, we don't need abortion because you can just give the
Had a
children,
baby.
yeah,
Give
have the
it to
baby
somebody
and,
else.
no harm, no foul. It's just a beautiful.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and so this sort of whitewashing or this sugarcoating or this Disneyfying, right? When there's actually sort of a Brothers Grimm parable underneath it.
Very good. Yes.
The problem is that it adds complexity and it makes people think about things that are uncomfortable. And the more you have to lose, then the more resistance you're going to have to
Right.
waking up, as you said.
Right,
So
right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And like adoptees, the first few years of, I also call it coming out of the fog after I met my sons. I searched and I tried for years, not knowing what the results were going to be. But those were some very tough years. It was hard on me, but I knew what I'd been through. It was what I saw happen to my sons as a result of those actions. Oh my God. That's like, you always think about your children once you become a mother more than you. You want all the best for them. And when I saw what had happened to their lives, and don't get me wrong, they grew up in very nice families. They had the essentials that they needed, but emotionally and psychologically, what adoption did to them, oh my God. It just took me years to try to work through that. And I feel like I have done a good job now. I hate it, but rather than feel guilty about it, I became an activist, which is what I was doing anyway on a lot of other fronts. And it was like, okay, we'll just pull adoption in here. It's another one of civil rights, which is what I'd been involved with for years. So, okay. And that's what I've been doing for the last 35 years.
amazing. So you had the experience where you became a birth mother and also the experiences that led up to becoming a woman, a young woman put in that position. And then this career as a therapist, becoming a birth mother who reunified, being a therapist. And so where does plant medicine fit into that?
Well, plant medicine came in. I think one of the things as I look back on my whole picture is, and I came by it rightly, in my family, idle hands were the devil's workshop. And so the motto was always busy, 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 and do good works. And so that's basically what I attempted to do through my career as a therapist and help other people. And you always get just as much as you give in that realm. So that wasn't just some altruistic role that I took on. I got a lot out of it, don't get me wrong. However, that is sort of how I pushed aside some of my needs, was by helping everybody else and staying busy, busy, busy. And so what I was referring to earlier when I did this move and we were looking at retirement, and I knew, Meoke, somewhere in the back of my mind, it was like, Leslie, this is not going to be as easy as you think it is. Sitting still, not staying in everybody else's family business and trying to help them and just kind of focusing on me. And it was very difficult as I approached it. So and there are two parts. I had also been on Prozac, an SSRI, for 25 years, which helped me, and I did feel better as a result of, but I decided I wanted to get off that. And that was my first venture into plant medicine, was that I got off of it and took a journey to see what I would find. And again, I had a very low period after that of adjusting to life without that kind of crutch of Prozac and wanting to do it more naturally. That was my goal, and learning to slow down. And so over the last few years, that was about 3.5, 4 years ago now. And I've done maybe a plant journey of a different type a year. And then came this opportunity with you. And this was the real game changer. This was the real, whoa, mama. As I said to you when I got to the retreat and I'd been there a couple of days, it was like, oh, me oak, if you told me this before I came. And it's the best thing I ever did for myself in my entire life. But was it easy? No, ma'am. I'm not going to tell a lie. It was big time. I just don't know how to say it in any other way. I got to the big time in terms of starting to understand what was going on with me and how much it needed to change, and how much I changed it in 1 week is astonishing. Now, I'm not saying my whole life is absolutely perfect now and I've accomplished every single goal. I'm working my buns off to keep up with what we started down there, but it was like opening a brand new vista. Did I answer that okay? That's how I got to plant medicine.
Yeah,
'Cause
no, thank you. I would like to unpack a few things
yeah,
there
yeah,
that you mentioned. You said that when you retired, when you moved, the stillness and the silence and not having the distractions, we fill our time up, right? So that we don't have to think. And
right.
when you stay busy, the brain actually can't think. You mess with the circuitry. And so looking back at that time, sitting still, can you describe that a little bit more of what was going on?
Yes. And actually, some of that really came to me while I was at the retreat, even stronger. What had been going on the last couple of years that I was avoiding was a lot of terror of being alone. And that was a surprise to me because I thought, oh, I love my time alone. I can be kind of aloof. People don't believe that because I'm a chatty Cathy and I always like being around people. But it's like, no, I like my alone time. Ah, alone time, I was so busy you couldn't see straight on the computer, on the this, doing that, whatever it was very busy alone time. In fact, here's a good example. When we were just arriving to the retreat, you let me know that through some communication, I think, of yours with the plants, that I'd been given my own room. Now, anybody in their right mind would think, wow, what a treat. And I got a solo room and everybody else is needing to bunk up with each other. Me, I was like, what did I do wrong? Why am I being sent off all alone? I'm too much for everybody. That's what I'd always felt. I'm just too effusive, to this, to that. And I need to be in my own room because I'll bug everybody. And so here came my shame that being alone wasn't a good thing. And the truth of the matter was, I was scared to be alone. And that was the big surprise, because being alone and being quiet, I already knew that I was going to be on an electronic vacation during that week. That part of my dieta was, no computer, no phone, which I absolutely loved. That was the best part of the whole trip, I got to tell you. But I was frightened, and being alone was really scary. And that goes back to early trauma in my life. I was abandoned by my mother when I was 5. I didn't lay eyes on her or hear her speak a word till I was 12. And I grew up in another part of my family. They did keep me, but I grew up in a part of the family where we never talked about that. And a 5-year-old like is saying, "Where's mommy?" And they're saying, just don't. She went off and left you. We're not talking about her. So I learned you really couldn't talk about tough stuff. And the last thing I wanted to do was to be in a room alone and feel it. So that was kind of a big surprise to me, how much well, a big surprise and an understanding that no wonder I had been pushing off getting quiet and being solo, because it brought back a lot in my early life, which was tough stuff.
And later we'll get more into the medicine
Yeah.
that is just in the container itself. You had said that you initially got involved with plant medicine because you wanted to get off Prozac. What led to that? You'd been on it for 25 years. Why not just keep going?
Which is what all my physicians said. Well, why would you want to get off? I'd tried numerous times.
Thanks for listening to the free part of our conversation. To listen to the rest, become a paid subscriber over at my Substack at meeok, that's meeok.substack.com. See you there.